In this video, we're going to talk about variable scope. So the variable scope is going to determine whether your variable is accessible within a block of code or not. So often we define some variables in our code, and then when we try to use them, we notice that we cannot use the variable from certain places of the code, while from other places of the code we can access the variable. And this depends on where did we define the variable and did we make it accessible to the other parts of the code or not. So the general rule is that a variable cannot be accessed outside of its scope, and a variable outside its scope is considered an undefined variable. So if you define a variable within a certain scope, if you are talking in a different scope or coding in a different scope, then you can use the same variable name in that scope. The reason being is that the variable is not going to be recognized in that scope. So let's see what we mean by scopes and variable scopes. Consider this code, for example. So I have a class that is defining a variable x inside the class. The class also contains a main method, and it also contains another void method called myMethod. Now, looking at the code, I can see that I define a variable x, and then within the main method I define another variable y, and then I have an if statement defining a variable z, and then I have an else statement defining other variables. So if I look at the scope of x, now the scope of x is the whole class, because x is accessible to the whole class. But if I look at the main method, which I have it in different color here, it defines three variables, namely y, z, and w. Now the whole class is called the scope of x because x is accessible to every part or every block of code we define in our class. Now this is going to be the scope of y, which is the main method. So anything outside the main method cannot access y, but everything inside the main method is in the same scope and it can indeed access y. What about the scope of z? It is only this part of the if statement. How do I know it's only this part of the if statement? Because I opened up a block of code, closed the block of code with the other curly bracket, and whatever is inside the curly bracket is my block of code. Similar thing for the else statement, which is now the scope of w. Now for myMethod, if I look at it, it is a separate block of code that is within the class. Now myMethod can access x because it is in the same scope as the variable x, but then it has its own code which starts from this curly bracket until this curly bracket, and then we define this variable here, which is q, and this is going to be the scope of q. Now the same thing goes for m. M is only going to be accessible within myMethod. Now if we look back at the if statement, w is accessible only to the else part and z is accessible only to the if part. And this basically tells us that in order for me to access a variable from a different location, I have to keep the variable and the block of code in the same scope. An example of this would be if you think about a TV that is in your house. So if the TV is in your house, then your neighbors cannot access the TV because it is contained in your house. But your room is in your house and you live in your room, so you can access whatever is in your house. Now if you have some other TV that's in your room, then you are the only one who can access that TV because you are in the scope of the TV, which is your room. Next topic we want to talk about is method overloading. So to overload is basically when you use the same thing for more than one purpose. And in Java, this refers to using a method to perform more than one purpose based on some arguments that we provide to the method. So it is going to allow us to use the same method name, and this is sometimes useful. For example, if I define a method that's going to add two integers, it cannot add two doubles. And previously we used to do it by having different method names. Now if I want to have the same name, which is add numbers for example, I will need to do something to allow my method to deal with integers and with decimals, which are doubles for example. We can also have some different instructions based on whatever arguments we give. So different arguments means we either have different types or even different number of arguments. Okay, so let's see an example on method overloading. For example, this is a class that I defined and I just called it overloading. Let's try to do our first example that we talked about, which is a method that is going to add two numbers. Okay, so let me go right here, and then this needs to be my main method, so public static void main, and inside my main method string args. So I will come here. Remember, to define a method, we also define our methods outside of the main method. They have to be in class, but they have to be outside of the main method. So let me go down here and define a method that is going to add two integers. I want to return the value of those two integers, so it is going to be public static, and then the return type is going to be an integer, and let me call this add numbers. Now this method will take two integers as the input, so I will say integer x and then another integer, let me call it y. What I will return is x plus y, and this concludes my method. Now again, if I want to define another method that is going to add doubles, I will have the same name, so I can just copy this and place it underneath it, and this now is going to add two decimals. Now I still have an error here because the methods both have the same name and both have the same data type. But notice that when I just change the arguments in here, the error is not here anymore. Okay, and it needs to return a double, and now I have two methods with the same name performing the same thing, but now one of them is going to add integers and the other one is going to add decimals. So let's try to test these out. So let me just have a regular print statement. Remember, I need to print whatever I get because these will just return the value. So if I call them right away from my code, I will not get anything. So I will call add numbers, and first time I will call it with integers 2 and 3 for example. And if I run my code, I will get 5 right here because 2 plus 3 is 5. I can just do 2.0 and 3.0, which is going to be doubles, but let's try to have some real decimal numbers in here, 2.3 and 3.5. Save this and run it back again, and now I'm able to add doubles. Notice that if I take this out and try to save it, now I have an error here saying that it's not expecting doubles, it's only expecting integers. And this is one example of overloading. Now another example we talked about is not just like numbers, we can just define other things in our methods. Let me show you an example. So if I say public void, and this is gonna be called my method. Now for my method, the first one I wanted to take a string, and in my method I will just print my string in here, Let me just add something to it. So the string is plus s, and let me create another one that's called my method as well, that is going to take a character. Now I can keep the name as s because remember these are in totally different scopes, so I'm not gonna have any error because s here is only known to this block of code and the other s here is only known to the other block of code. But let's have it c to be more convenient, and I will say the character is c. I can do the same thing with numbers, booleans, any data type. So public static void my method, and this time I wanted to take let's say an integer I, and what I'll do is I will just say system.out.println the number is plus whatever the number is, and keep in mind now I can do this for any data type that I'm supporting. Now when I call this from my main method, if I supply it with a string, it is going to call this block. If I supply it with a character, it is going to call this block. And if I supply it with an integer, it is going to call this block of code. Now keep in mind when you overload a method, it has to have the same name. Return type doesn't matter, and arguments doesn't matter. In fact, oftentimes you will change the return types and you will change the argument list. So again, let's test out our method right here. Let's take out this line, and remember this is a void method, so I will not print it. I will call my method right away. So my method, and I will give it some arguments in here. So a string hello, for example, and let me just have the other ones called right after it. So the second one is going to take a character, which is a. The third one is going to take an integer, let's say 10. Now I can just run my code, and it is going to call the first method for the first time because we gave it a string. Second one is going to call the one that takes in a character because we gave it a character as input. Third one is going to take or to call this because we gave it an integer as its input. Now if I try to call it with a boolean or a double, it is not going to work, and the reason is I never defined one that takes a double. If I want it to work, I have to go back and overload my method to be able to handle doubles. And this is method overloading.